Hey everyone, this is Will, and welcome to this brand new and exciting episode of The Missing Piece. When we look around the world today, the United States, in terms of the foreign policy, is standing at the crossroads. On one hand, this nation is gearing up its effort at trying to collaborate the much greater effort with the countries in Southeast Asia. But meanwhile, building the rivalries and also facing the competitors such as China, it's no easy case. But at the same time, it's crucial that we need to understand what is happening within this country today, not just the US, but China. This country with the population of 1.4 billion people. But today, compared with 1949, it's no longer just a name on the map. It's actually one of the key players among the international communities. So that's why today it's my great honor to invite our distinguished guest, Dr. Klaus Mu. And again, Dr. Mu has been the president of Zeppelin University and the chair of Modern China Studies since June 1st, 2020. However, in 2019, Dr. Mu came out one of this amazing, should I say, a remarkable book and entitled Making China Modern, From the Great Qing to Xi Jinping, and was published by Harvard University Press, and also it's been available in German language as well. So today, I'm going to dive into this book with Dr. Mu to discover what research and intention behind this book, and how should we understand this one of the largest political and economic shift in the world today. Without further ado, Professor Mu, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Professor Mu, I want to get started. Again, as I mentioned in the intro, you are not the first person who wrote about China. But meanwhile, if we look at the world today, look at the people around the entire world, people are fascinated about this country. Now, the first question I want to ask Professor Mu is, how should we understand China today, especially under this pandemic and this global competition or this economic rivalry with other countries? What do you make of that?
Well, thank you so much. An excellent question. And so as I try to explain in the book, you're absolutely right. I'm not the first to write about China, definitely not, and not the first general history. But my approach is a little bit different because I look at the institutions in China. So I'm interested in the way Chinese people organize their society and their economy and their businesses. And I think I look for explanations for the situation that China is in today by tracking down the institutional development of certain organizations. So if we look back to your question, if we look at China today, what makes China special, or what makes it different, and what explains the situation or the development in contemporary China is its institutional roots, its history behind these institutions.
You know, Professor, again, when we talk about China, and again, I agree with you that the word institution, it's so critical and it's so essential for us to understand, not just about China, but any other countries in the world. But for China, when I hear the word institutions, naturally I will think about another one. It's called regulations, rules. But we know that, again, as I mentioned before, comparing with 1949, that was only a name on the map, and the world started to realize China was actually a country, was not actually a name per se. But fast forward, regulations and rules, we always say, tend to be broken. So again, under current leader Xi Jinping, how should we understand the word institution? Does that mean China is trying to be unconventional, to be untraditional, in order to keep up with the paces with the rest of the world?
So if we go back and we see, have this entire development, in front of our eyes, I think what we can see is also today that Xi Jinping understands and tries to use the institutions that he has found to his advantage. So, it's not, they tend to be broken. That's to some degree true. But then on the other hand, I think the ambition or the intention is of today's China is exactly to keep these institutions alive. Now, institution is very abstract. What are we talking about? We are talking about, for instance, certain ways to organize society that can be tracked down to the Soviet Union, because in the end, it's a socialist country. But this alone is not the entire explanation. I think we also have to look back to earlier traditions. So, for instance, what makes China successful today? These are the businesses, but it's not the state-run businesses. It's the private businesses, the family businesses. And they are organized in a way that is very similar to the way they were organized before 1949. So the situation in China we see today is very hybrid. You see socialist institutions, pre-modern Chinese institutions, and also, of course, American impact or influence is also visible. So it's a very hybrid, a system that is also full of tensions in a way.
Professor, I want to start reading something that you actually wrote in the book. And again, I strongly encourage everyone to get a copy of this amazing masterpiece. Now, Professor Mu, this is something that you wrote in the introduction. You said, I quote, "China was at the center of an interconnected and global network of engagement in the past and remains so in the present." It's so interesting that on one side, China needs allies and China needs partners in terms of building this economic power and this political changes or political powerhouse. But meanwhile, China is very careful in terms of picking the allies or picking even the enemies. So, Professor, from your perspective, how would you evaluate the recent progress under the current leader in terms of smoothing the relationship with foes and also meanwhile strengthening the relationship with friends or allies? What is your take on that?
Thank you so much. Also, excellent question. I mean, if we look at China today, I think what we can see is that it has very few friends, very few really good friends. And then it has a lot of countries that are interested in trading with China, in doing business with China, because China is very important. But I wouldn't say that they are necessarily friends. So the problem that China faces today is, I think that in most respects, it's more or less stands alone. So let me give you an example. For instance, we all know the Ukraine crisis and the war there and so on. So, and there's a lot of non-Western countries who actually have share China's skepticism of the Western position, whether rightly so or not. Let's not discuss this. But there's, from Brazil to India, they all have reservations. But China has not managed to become the leader or even the spokesperson, for these non-Western groups who thinks we don't, we sort of neutral in the conflict. It hasn't. And I think that, again, shows that China has difficulties forming real alliances. And I think this is a major challenge for China. But it has, you're absolutely right, managed to smooth conflicts with countries in the neighborhood. It had resolved many border issues, and so in many ways it has sort of, found solutions to the problems, but it hasn't managed to have a real friend in the world. That's my opinion, at least.
Professor, again, going back to your book, you specifically talk about, again, starting the book, the rise and the fall of Qing China. It's so interesting that historically speaking, I have to say, you are the few of the writers that I ever encounter when we study Chinese history that willing to start the chapters or willing to start the books going back to the dynasty periods of China. Again, at that moment, I want to say, during those dynastic periods, it was tumultuous for China to find the word identity. It was really difficult comparing with how far China has come today. So my next question is, why did you start the chapter with the Qing Dynasty? What was something special about that period? And also, how does that period reflects what is happening today, or maybe perhaps even if I can be careful, pave the way for us to understand how China continued to progress over the years?
Yeah. So during Qing China, when my book begins, we see a China that is sort of already at the apex of its dynastical development. It is also at the center of a global web of trade relations. It's easily forgotten that during this period of time, China already delivers a product to the world that the world really, wants and consumes and buys from China, and that is porcelain. Remember that China produces porcelain since the 9th century, but Europe only starts to produce its own porcelain in the 19th or late 18th or early 19th century. So China has an enormous advantage. It has a product that everybody can use, because if you use porcelain, you can actually consume hot food much easier, much more convenient. It's also very hygienic because, it has a very smooth surface. It can be cleaned easily. So at this time, China has a big trade surplus with Europe, just like today. It sells much more than it can buy from Europe. So, and I think that was a brilliant point to start a history about China, because we can see China as being as a major power that is technologically advanced and that already dominates the world market. So in many ways, your question is, how does it pave, our understanding, the way for understanding China today is that when we look at China today, that is not a new development. China has just managed to come back in a position that it already occupied before during the Qing Dynasty.
Professor Mu, it's so interesting that to listen to this part of the Chinese history, but meanwhile, again, going back to specific chapters that you wrote and cover, when we talk about China, or, to be specific, we talk about any period of China, there were conflicts and there were revolutions and there were even the word shame, something that China, historically speaking, was not proud. But meanwhile, any country went through transitions, always faced failures and setbacks. But for China, again, before 1949, nobody took this country seriously. And everyone thought it was again, we'll say new kid on the block or a place in the back burner. But less than 70 or even less than years, that China is no longer just a name that everyone's map. It's actually a nation that willing or can be bold enough to challenge another major power. So I want to, the question to you, Professor, is how should we, historically speaking, evaluate all those failures and setbacks that China went through over the period, especially that during the Mao Revolution, again, under different administrations or leaders, that China was actually struggling not only politically, but also economically?
I think what China is very good at is that it not only has these setbacks, because you're right, every nation has setbacks. Every nation suffers humiliations. Every nation goes through periods of misery and hardship. But what China did is it learned from its mistakes. And I think that makes it really outstanding. And that applies not only to the Communist Party, who learned from its mistakes under Mao, who learned from the economic problems that were produced during this time, and then came out with a reform and opening policy that contradicted most of what had happened before, but it also applies to earlier periods. So I think in many ways that where my institutional approach comes in. What we see is also a willingness to make these institutions better by looking at the rules and regulations and always asking, are they working? Can they be improved? Do we need to adopt? Has the world changed? So for me, that is a key secret for China's success.
Back in 1972, the former U.S. President Richard Nixon did something unprecedented And he actually went to China for the first time. And that's why what we use the word open door policy. Again, two nations for the first time started the official communication. Now, back in the days, again, Professor, you're familiar with also another term. It's called the ping pong diplomacy. So, which means ping pong was, or is still a popular sport worldwide. But back in the days, ping pong was actually the key to open the door to break down the barriers between the two countries. But fast forward today, we are looking at the relationship between U.S. and China. There's no ping pong diplomacy, and there's no open door diplomacy. And again, two friendly nations today became these competitors, became these rivalries with each other. What happened? Did one side mess up the entire system, or both sides should take a step back, re-examine this relationship?
I think, I'm with you, and I think both sides should step back and re-examine and really give it a hard think what's happening. Because as it always is in such an escalating tensions, this is never only one side. It takes two to tango, so to speak. And in that sort of conflict, it also takes two sides to be distrustful of each other. And I think that is a big problem for the world, for Europe, for Germany, and also for the US and for China. So what we would need, and I totally agree with you, what we would need is ping pong diplomacy. What we need is keep the channels open, engage in dialogue. This has to be on an equal level. But there has to be an understanding that if we don't manage this relationship well, it will have effect on all of us, our prosperity, our economic system. We now know from Corona and the impact of the Ukraine war, it will lead, to setbacks and impoverishment all over the world. So I think it's extremely important to keep the door open and to engage in a dialogue.
Professor, I want to shift our gear to something else that you also touch on a book, which is very much significant, not just about the Chinese government, but the Chinese people. Specifically that you wrote that through the early Qing Dynasty until, again, after 1949 until today, Chinese people have been very active in playing this significant role in pushing the social, political, and cultural agenda. Now, from your perspective, how should we understand the changes of China through the eyes of not just the political parties, not just the political members, but the average citizens? How much do you think that their voices matter from the history until today?
I think their voices matter greatly. And I tried in the book, indeed, to restore agency to the population and to the regular people and shift the attention away from the leaders and the big names, but rather to the creativity and the hard work of ordinary Chinese. And so for me, the explanation of this miracle, this economic miracle that China went through in the last 30, 40 years is mostly due to the hard work of the Chinese people and to the creativity and the farsightedness of the entrepreneurs and the business people and the thinkers and the intellectuals. So for me, how do we evaluate this is also to understand that China is a very diverse place and also a very dynamic place. And we have to look very carefully because today's perspective on China is that we really see the government in everything and see the government controlling everything. And that is wrong, because I think by such a perspective, leads us to ignore possibilities to engage with China and to have a good dialogue, civil society to civil society.
Comparing with the predecessors, we're looking at multiple generations, again, from Chairman Mao, to the next successor until today, Xi Jinping. In comparison and contrast, current Chinese leader, I guess, by the general survey, seems more friendly or more down to earth, more approachable to the average citizens. Now, the question to you, Professor, is how much does it help for the Chinese leader today to become more approachable and much more closer to the Chinese people, and in terms of delegating this country? Because, again, back in the days that when we think about Chairman Mao and when we think about all these party leaders, I guess we use the word idolize them. There's a huge, not only what we called economic gap, but also this ideological gap. But today, when we look at the media, when we look at the reports one after another, the leaders today in China is no longer up in the air, but is willing to bring himself down to the people in order to build and share commonalities. How feasible, or how can I say practical it is for the Chinese leader to continue this path, and what purpose or what greater benefits could we see that?
It is absolutely necessary. It is inevitable for any Chinese leader to be in touch with the population and to be in touch with the ordinary Chinese. Because, that we have discussed this in the earlier question. The Chinese population always had a say. And in the end, even in a system like in China today, it is absolutely necessary to be attuned to the, to the mood, the atmosphere, the attitudes, the problems, the worries within the Chinese population. And I think it is, however, in a country as big as China, always a huge challenge for the leadership, to be in touch with society, because it is huge, and the distance, between north and south, east and west, is enormous. And we speak about 1.3 billion people, so it's an enormous challenge. And I think, of course, but the current leadership, as well as past leadership, was keenly aware of the fact that they need the support of the population. And so what we can see now today is different methods or tools to actually sort of, maintain that support. And that is through media, that is through, of course, through speeches, this is through a number of things.
Professor, I want to get to the last proportion of our conversation. I know you're very busy, so I will keep the questions really short. Let's talk about sovereignty, the word, again, that referring to the book that you wrote. For years that China has never been interested in meddling any other international affairs, because, again, the Chinese government believe what's happening outside should be solved within their own countries as well. Now, that goes the same thing with the principle in China. But right now, there are so many other countries that are trying to meddle with Chinese domestic affairs in terms of territorial dispute, in terms of human rights watch, and also many other political or economic reasons. So the question to you is, how do you think that China is positioning itself in terms of dealing with all those what we called, quote, noises? So on the other hand, China can't avoid or can't escape all those interruptions or noises. But meanwhile, China needs to stay focused in order to produce much greater fruit or produce much a grander results for the greater future. So how do you think China should position itself in the midst of the entire interruption or noises?
Well, the world has become a very difficult place, right? And a place where we can see that, what analysts of international relations call a multipolar world. So it's also a world that has no longer the clear structure of the past, and things are obviously shifting, and structures are dissolving, and so I think for China's positioning in a world of change, it's an enormous challenge. And I think on the one hand, it's very good to stick to its own, country or sphere and not meddle in others. But on the other hand, China is also, of course, always thinking that it needs to secure its shipping lines. It needs to project power abroad. It's perhaps no longer possible, to just be only in your own country. And that applies for other countries as well. Let's not forget, we live in a globalized world and we are highly interdependent of each other. And there are certain areas like climate change that cannot be solved by one country alone. So it needs countries to work together. And I think, however, we can also say that because international institutions like the United Nations have become weakened over time. And also, I think, because, to be honest, because of Western criticism, especially American criticism, we now lack, a structure to actually work together on these things. But I don't think it's possible, and I don't think it's enough, to just focus on your own country, because the world we live in does simply not make that possible.
But what about the leaders, for example, the newly elected leader in South Korea, and also the current German chancellor, and also the Japanese prime minister? I mean, again, even the latest one, the brand new prime minister in Australia. All these leaders today have come out numerous times, or one way or another, that saying that these countries needs to be much tougher on China, politically or economically. But again, Professor Mu-Han, as what you said, if this is the game we play, no one is going to win in the end, because we can't afford to have another major war, politically speaking or militarily speaking. This is not something we want to see. But meanwhile, those such rhetoric could be seen as a threat to China. How do you think that China or the Chinese government should react to those noises?
Right. So again, I think the only way, to solve that problem or to solve that difficult situation, which you described, I think, very correctly, is to build trust and to maintain dialogue. So I think the Chinese government has to build trust with its neighbors and also with other countries. And there is still a possibility, especially I think in Europe, but also in other areas of the world. And there is this possibility to engage in this dialogue and to find common ground. Because not only is it that a war would be harmful, but we also face major challenges in the world. Also think about the digital transformation. That when computers or robots replace human workers, that will affect all of us. And we need all of us, all of humanity needs a sort of a solution. So that's why I'm so strongly in favor to say there is no solution to global problems without China. We need China in that. And on the other hand, China also needs the world. And I think both sides need to understand that and need to build bridges.
Professor Mu-Han, I got two more questions before wrapping up this conversation. Now, let's talk about the younger generations in China. Not only the younger generations in China, but also today, cities nationwide are becoming the centers which attract international talents. Statistically speaking, that every year pre-pandemic or even today, I guess, despite the whole restriction and lockdown, more and more international students are flooding into China. Either they're advancing their education degree, or they're becoming entrepreneurs, or they're seeking ways to, find identity in this country. Now, from your perspective, Professor, quickly, how essential it is for China continue to have this open door policy or to have this open door welcoming arms in order to embrace the changes by welcoming those international talents?
And it's absolutely crucial, because I think among other things, what we can see is that certain talents are already in demand or in need in many areas of the world, and there's a sort of a global competition, for the brightest minds, and the brightest minds are not that many, so I think it's extremely important to keep the door open. But on the other hand, I also think it's extremely important for the world to be welcoming Chinese students. And I'm very worried about this growing hostility toward the Chinese student populations for instance, in the US. because they are suspected to be spying for the government.
That's right.
And so on and so forth. Very, very dangerous. So I think both sides need to keep the door open, because this exchange of young people and this, that sort of this fluctuation of young people across the globe, that is our chance for the future. We need a globally minded young people.
Professor Mu, I want to wrap up our conversation again, going back to this book. Again, ladies and gentlemen, I'm holding this book right now. It's written by Professor Mu. It's called Making China Modern. Now, let's end this conversation with a simple question. You've written this book. Again, you told us stories, not just about the political parties, but also the people in China. For every single reader, when we finish reading your book, what would you want readers to understand when we finish reading this amazing book? Is there anything that particular have on your mind that we should or we ought to understand, even as a Chinese national or as an outsider today?
I think that my basic point, that I would like people to take away is that China can offer so much to the world. In terms of its history, it's also its wisdom that it has, its experiences that it has made, and that the people of China have made, that its approach to certain things, its perspective. So there is a wealth and a richness, that can actually help us all. So my point would be that we evaluate, that we welcome, this richness that China gives the world, and we see it as something fruitful and positive.
Well, Professor Mu, one thing I can tell you is, for anyone who are still dying, would like to know this country and would like to know the history or how historical affairs and events have shaped this country, one thing I want to say is this is a good book, or this is a must read. Again, Dr. Klaus Mu and has been a president of Zeppelin University and the chair of Modern China Studies since June 1st, 2020. And in 2019, his work, Making China Modern, From the Great Qing to Xi Jinping, was published by Harvard University and also is available in the German language. So again, Professor Mu, thank you so much for taking your time to join the show. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and we love to have you back again as we continue to discover more about the country and also this international relationship between China and the rest of the world. Thank you so much for doing this.